Chapter 1. The Cathars. Once upon a time. The fairy stories start in this way, that tell of fairies, orcs, gnomes, little mermaids, and other creatures that were not once upon a time, for the simple reason that they did not exist. The beginning once upon a time would be much more appropriate for history books. History, that which is true history, is indeed supported by the reality that there was a time, people, languages, religions, cities. It is in the nature of things to disappear, given that all that begins has to end. But that doesn't mean that civilizations disappearing have almost always been destroyed by violence and their culture deliberately cancelled and forgotten. History is written by the victors. Most of the time, these were none other than a criminal thirst for blood and power. Heroes who conquered peoples and lands, leaving death and destruction behind. After victory, they preoccupied themselves writing history of their glorious escapades, where the defeated were portrayed as enemies. Therefore, it was necessary to denigrate and demonize them, as in fact always happened. Conquered territories were integrated into those of the invaders, and the people living there had to abandon their ways and customs considered barbaric, which often resulted in the irredeemable loss of their language and culture. We must always keep this in mind when we set ourselves to study history. Once upon a time there were the Cathars. They weren't the people who had one language, one territory. Cathars is the name still given to them today, but already in the Middle Ages to a certain type of heretic. Heretics, a worrying term, behind which we picture obsessed and fanatical individuals who represent a real menace to society. And one thinks that, maybe with the burnings at the stake and in other less bloody ways, it was, however, necessary to get rid of them. We imagine them like that because this is how they have been described for centuries. By who? By the conquerors, naturally. The Inquisition, in this case, those who had fought them. This would suffice to understand that what was written about them could not be objective. As far as the Cathars are concerned, not only were they completely exterminated, but also no traces were left of their writings or testimonies in their favour. Today we are helped by a growing interest in the Cathars, above all in southern France, in Occitania, where the tour of the Cathar castles, currently pushed by all the tourist agencies, is very much in fashion. There is, however, also a serious aspect, represented in all the books coming out these years. The problem is that they mainly treat of French Catharism, while over that of the Italian, which as we shall see was perhaps more relevant, looms an almost absolute silence. But also slowly in Italy, in a region in which once upon a time were the Cathars, a desire was beginning to know the true past, the real history, and awareness is growing that they represent a glorious period in history. Not glorious because they had won some wars, but because they were free men and women, capable of independent thinking, and they had a nobility of spirit, a coherence, and a true dignity that was exceptional for those times. Catharism offers a different view of the Christian religion, a way that seems more convincing. That the cream of European society adhered to in large measure in those days: aristocracy, intellectuals, the growing bourgeoisie. Heresy spread like wildfire, as the chronicles report, and when the church got wind of it and tried to run for cover, it increased in some regions by 30 to 50% of the overall population. Catharism was the most imposing unorthodox religious phenomenon of the Middle Ages, also due to its duration in time, from the 10th to the 15th century, and certainly represented a danger for the Church concerned with its own immense power. A very grave danger in the face of so many heretical sects, despite the persecutions that were continuing to rise up and spread in the Middle Ages. The difference between the Cathars and these sects is profound. The adherents of the various sects came to be considered heretics, but in reality they weren't, because they didn't propose different doctrines to those of the Church, nor intended to take its place. They want to follow Christ living in poverty, so much so that they came to be known as pauperisti. It's true that they criticized the Church, accusing it of being a long way from the gospel message, of enriching themselves too much. Criticisms also coming from persons such as Francis of Assisi, but like him, they recognized in it the authority and the sacraments. The Cathars, instead, not only preached doctrines that diverged on many questions from the Church of Rome, but they reclaimed orthodoxy in it so much that they defined themselves as the good Christians, the true Christians. They opposed themselves to the Church, in which they did not recognize the authority nor the sacraments, and presented themselves as the true Christian Church, saying that it was directly descended from the apostles and the original Christian community, from which they maintained the rites and the sacraments. The Christianity that the Cathars presented pleased and convinced. It convinced through its adherence to the message of the gospel and by the extreme consistency with which it was lived. In a period in which the Catholic Church behaved scandalously, to say the least, their clergy lived in such an exemplary manner that the word Cathars came to be interpreted as pure ones, even by their enemies. A true, real war was engaged against the Cathars that lasted a long time, entire centuries, on account of both their large diffusion, since they were present in all of Europe under different names, Bogomils, Albigensians, Patarines, and still more, from Bulgaria to Flanders, from Spain to Germany. Also, because, being loved and respected everywhere, they enjoyed a solidarity with the people who helped and protected them. Nevertheless, in the end, the long, hard struggle against them was crowned as a victory, assuming that a church that was required to follow the dictates of the gospel could call a savage extermination a victory. Their story then was written by those who had fought them, and in this case the aim was to say nothing more of them, to forget about them, and when if they are spoken of, to say so many false and infamous things. Even in texts written so the inquisitors knew Cathar doctrines, these came to be twisted and distorted in ways. This isn't a case of my conjectures, but of precise examples. As Thomas Aquinas writes, once written, a book can come into the hands of anyone, with the danger that the heretical doctrines come to be propagated. Therefore, it was necessary to show them using obscure terms in a way that they are kept hidden from the simple ones who could not understand them. Even the doctrine of Christ must be presented in a way that it was clear to those to whom it was fitting to know. So the Cathars disappeared without leaving a trace of themselves in European culture, wrote Raoul Mancelli in the last century. Also considered today in this field the most authoritative Italian scholar. Now, if one considers Catharism mostly developed in southern France and north-central Italy, including Tuscany, that is, in the region that in these same years was born the great poetry that was at the origin of European culture, and that the nobility above all adhered to Catharism, who were, coincidentally, the initiators and primary exponents of Occitan poetry. Mancelli's assertion seems at least debatable. The first possibilities of a coincidence or almost of an interrelationship between Cathars and troubadours, goes back to almost a century ago. At first, such ideas were opposed, but they are accepted now, at least partly, in academic fields. Strangely, these studies never extended to the situation in Italy, where Mancelli's assertion is still uncritically accepted that the Cathars left no trace in Italian culture and society. It's not true. The Cathars were exterminated, their writings burned. But despite the furious destruction, there was a work that sang of their praises, displayed their doctrines in it, and extolled their virtues. And it is not a minor work, it is the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri.